In the early years of the Cold War, Washington, D.C. moved with quiet urgency. Black sedans rolled slowly past marble buildings. Men in dark suits carried thin briefcases up wide stone steps. Inside, typewriters clicked. Filing cabinets shut with a metallic snap. Telephones rang, then fell silent. It was a time when the world felt uncertain. The Second World War had ended, but peace did not feel secure. A new kind of conflict had begun, quieter, colder, and far more unsettling. The Soviet Union stood across an ideological divide. Communism versus democracy. East versus West. But the greatest fear was not invasion by land or sea. It was something unseen. American prisoners of war returned from Korea with stories that troubled military leaders. Some had signed confessions. Others had denounced their own country on radio broadcasts. How could that happen? Newspapers began using a strange new word, brainwashing. Could the human mind be captured? Could loyalty be erased and replaced? Could a person be turned against everything they once believed? These questions did not belong only to science fiction. They were discussed in classified meetings in secure rooms, behind closed doors. Within the halls of the Central Intelligence Agency, concern grew. If America's enemies were experimenting with psychological control, then the United States could not afford to fall behind. The Cold War was not just a contest of armies and missiles. It was a contest of knowledge, of secrets, of power over information, and perhaps over the human will itself. In 1953, a project was approved. Its name would never appear in headlines. It would not be debated publicly. It would not be explained to the American people. It would exist in fragments, hidden in budgets, concealed in universities, buried inside research grants. The code name was simple. MKUltra. For more than 20 years. It operated in silence. It would involve scientists, doctors, prisoners, patients, and ordinary citizens who never knew they were part of an experiment. Some would suffer confusion. Some would suffer lasting harm. One man would fall from a hotel window in New York City, and his family would spend decades searching for answers. Much of what happened was never meant to be. Discovered. In 1973, as scrutiny began to close in, thousands of documents were destroyed, shredded, burned, erased. And yet not everything vanished. A few boxes of records survived. Testimony was taken. Questions were asked, and what emerged would challenge Americans to reconsider something fundamental. How far should a government go in the name of national security? Tonight we step back into that world of secrecy and fear, into laboratories and safe houses, into hospital wards and Senate hearing rooms, into a story born from anxiety and sustained by silence. Because sometimes the most powerful weapon is not a bomb, not a bullet, but the human mind. MKUltra, the CIA mind control program. In 1945, the world exhaled. World War II was over. Cities lay in ruins across Europe and Asia. Tens of millions were dead. And for Americans, there was a deep and understandable hope that peace would finally settle in for good. But peace did not arrive the way many expected. Instead, a new rivalry began to take shape, quieter than war, but no less dangerous. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged from the ashes as superpowers. Allies only months before, they now stood divided by ideology, suspicion, and ambition. Democracy and capitalism on one side, communism on the other. By the late 1940s, the Cold War had taken hold. The Iron Curtain descended across Eastern Europe. Berlin was blockaded. Nuclear weapons were no longer a secret. They were a reality. And Americans began practicing duck and cover drills in classrooms, preparing for a war that everyone prayed would never come. But beneath the fear of bombs was another anxiety, one harder to define. What if the enemy could control not just territory, but thought? During the Korean War, American prisoners of war appeared in recorded broadcasts. Some admitted to war crimes. Others criticized the United States. A few expressed sympathy for communism. Military officials were stunned. How could trained soldiers, raised in American values, speak that way? Were they tortured, drugged, hypnotized? Or had something more subtle happened? A term began circulating in newspapers and intelligence briefings: brainwashing. The idea was chilling. It suggested that the human mind, the very core of identity, could be reshaped like clay. In 1950, the American public read accounts of communist re-education programs in China. Reports described prisoners subjected to isolation, sleep deprivation, relentless interrogation. Confessions were extracted. Beliefs were altered. At least, that was the fear. Whether the threat was exaggerated or misunderstood hardly mattered at the time. What mattered was perception. And perception in the early Cold War was shaped by uncertainty. In Washington, intelligence leaders were asking urgent questions. If communist regimes were experimenting with psychological manipulation, what would stop them from using it against American diplomats? Against military officers? Against spies? Or even against the American public itself? Inside the Central Intelligence Agency, an organization still young, having been created in 1947, officials were under pressure to anticipate the next move of a secretive adversary. The CIA was born in a world that no longer trusted openness. Secrecy was not only tolerated, it was expected. The public understood that some information had to remain hidden in order to keep the nation safe. And yet, secrecy can grow. By the early 1950s, the fear of communist infiltration had seeped into American political life. Senator Joseph McCarthy warned of hidden enemies within the government. Careers were ruined. Allegations spread faster than proof. The atmosphere was thick with suspicion. In that climate, it became easier to imagine worst-case scenarios, harder to dismiss unlikely possibilities. Could the Soviets possess a chemical compound capable of breaking down resistance? Could they have perfected hypnosis as a weapon? Could they create a Manchurian candidate, an unwitting assassin programmed to act on command? Years later, those fears would be dramatized in the film The Manchurian Candidate. But in the early 1950s, the concept did not feel like fiction. It felt like a looming possibility. And so American intelligence agencies began studying everything they could find on psychological warfare. Captured documents from Nazi Germany were examined. Japanese wartime interrogation techniques were analyzed. Reports from defectors were scrutinized. The question was not simply how to resist mind control. It was whether such control could be harnessed. In 1953, a new director took the helm at the CIA, Allen Dulles. Dulles was a seasoned intelligence officer. He believed the Cold War was a long, patient struggle, one that required innovation and bold thinking. In a speech that same year, he warned publicly about the dangers of communist brain warfare. He described it as a battle for men's minds, a conflict fought without traditional weapons. Privately, within the agency, the urgency was even stronger. If adversaries were exploring the frontiers of the mind, the United States could not afford to stand still. Falling behind could mean vulnerability, and vulnerability in the nuclear age felt unacceptable. The early Cold War was not merely about defense. It was about anticipation. Officials believed they had to imagine threats before those threats fully materialized, and imagination, when fueled by fear, can travel far. American scientists were entering a new era as well. The post-war years brought rapid advances in chemistry, psychology, and medicine. Laboratories were discovering powerful new substances. Researchers were studying the brain with fresh curiosity. The boundaries of knowledge were expanding. Some in intelligence circles began to wonder, could these scientific tools be adapted for national security? Could drugs influence memory? Could sensory deprivation break down resistance? Could certain techniques make a person more suggestible? At first, these questions might have sounded speculative, even abstract. But in a world shaped by atomic weapons and espionage, speculation quickly became strategy. The CIA had already begun smaller research efforts under earlier code names, exploring interrogation methods and chemical agents. These projects were fragmented and scattered across departments. What was needed, some believed, was coordination. A central effort, something systematic, something classified at the highest level. And so the idea began to take shape, not in a single dramatic moment, but gradually through memos and conversations, through budget requests and quiet approvals. The United States would not simply react to the threat of mind control. It would investigate it. Fully. The logic, at least on paper, was straightforward. If an enemy possessed a weapon capable of altering thought, the only way to defend against it was to understand it. And the only way to understand it was to experiment. Few outside a small circle of officials knew these discussions were taking place. The American public was focused on other fears: nuclear stockpiles, spy trials, the arms race. They could see bomb shelters being built. They could hear politicians speak of missiles and ideology. What they could not see were the early outlines of a different kind of program, one that would explore the most intimate frontier of all. The human mind. The Cold War climate did not invent secrecy, but it normalized it. It encouraged a belief that extraordinary measures might be justified by extraordinary threats. History has shown that fear can be a powerful motivator. It can inspire resilience. It can also blur lines. By the spring of 1953, those lines were beginning to shift inside the intelligence community. A formal proposal would soon be approved. Funding would be allocated. A chemist named Sidney Gottlieb would be placed in charge, and a program would be born, one that operated for 2 decades, touching universities, hospitals, prisons, and military bases. But at this moment, in the early 1950s, none of that was yet visible. There was only tension, suspicion, a sense that the next Breakthrough in warfare might not come from rockets or submarines, but from laboratories studying perception and consciousness. The Cold War was often described as a chess match, careful, strategic, calculated, but chess pieces do not have minds of their own. Human beings do, and if those minds could be influenced, fractured, or reshaped, the implications would reach far beyond any battlefield. In Washington, doors closed quietly behind senior officials. Documents were stamped and filed. Budgets were signed. A decision was made, not in anger, not in panic, but in calculated concern. If mind control was possible, America would find out, and in doing so, it would step into territory few had ever imagined. What began as a defensive inquiry would soon expand into something far more ambitious and far more troubling. By the spring of 1953, the Cold War had settled into a tense rhythm. The Korean War was winding down. Nuclear weapons were multiplying. Intelligence agencies on both sides of the Iron Curtain were racing not only for information, but for advantage. Inside the Central Intelligence Agency, a quiet decision was finalized. On April 13, 1953, CIA Director Alan Dulles approved a new program. Its code name was Clinical. Abstract, MKUltra. The name revealed nothing. That was intentional. Officially, MKUltra was described in dry, bureaucratic language. It would study chemical, biological, and radiological materials capable of employment in clandestine operations to control human behavior. Behind that language was a simple idea. If there were substances or techniques that could influence the human mind, the United States needed to understand them first. To oversee the program, the CIA chose a chemist named Sidney Gottlieb. Gottlieb did not fit the popular image of a spy. He was soft-spoken, intellectual, a man with a doctorate in chemistry. He lived modestly, raised goats, and practiced folk dancing. But within the agency, he was known for something else, a willingness to explore unconventional methods. Gottlieb believed that the mind was a kind of battlefield, and battlefields required experimentation. MKUltra would not be a single experiment. It would not operate in one location. Instead, it would become a network, sprawling, fragmented, deliberately obscured. Over time, the program would grow to include 149 known subjects. Each had its own focus. Each had its own budget line. Many were hidden inside grants to universities, hospitals, and research foundations. Often, the institutions receiving the money had no idea the funds originated from the CIA. Front organizations were created to distribute the grants. Foundations with respectable names masked the true source of funding. Paper trails were minimized. Documentation was compartmentalized. The secrecy was not merely for protection from foreign adversaries. It was also protection from domestic scrutiny. In the early 1950s, the ethical framework for human experimentation was still evolving. The Nuremberg trials had exposed horrific medical abuses by Nazi doctors, and the Nuremberg Code had emphasized voluntary consent. But enforcement was inconsistent. Oversight was limited. And in the realm of national security, urgency often outweighed caution. MKUltra's early focus centered on chemicals, particularly one chemical that had recently captured scientific attention: lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD, first synthesized in 1938 by Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann. LSD had remarkable psychological effects. Small doses could produce vivid hallucinations, altered perception, and dramatic shifts in mood. To some, it appeared unpredictable. To others, it appeared promising. If a drug could temporarily dissolve a person's sense of reality, could it also weaken resistance? Could it make someone more talkative, more compliant? Could it be used in interrogations? Sidney Gottlieb became fascinated with LSD. The CIA began purchasing large quantities of the substance, eventually acquiring much of the world's supply. Experiments began cautiously. At first, they were conducted on volunteers within the agency. CIA employees were given LSD to observe its effects. Some were informed. Others were not. The results were inconsistent. Some subjects became anxious. Others laughed uncontrollably. A few experienced paranoia. Time seemed distorted. Reality felt fluid. For intelligence officers seeking precision, the unpredictability posed a challenge. But unpredictability also suggested power. If LSD could destabilize perception so profoundly, perhaps it could disrupt hostile interrogators. Perhaps it could disorient foreign agents. Perhaps it could even be slipped into an enemy's drink. The possibilities expanded, and so did the scope of MKUltra. The program soon branched into other areas: hypnosis, electroshock, sensory deprivation, isolation techniques. Researchers were tasked with studying how long a person could endure darkness and silence. Others examined whether repeated messages could alter belief patterns. The CIA also explored combinations: drugs paired with hypnosis, sleep deprivation combined with chemical agents. The goal was ambitious: to identify methods that could break down psychological defenses and rebuild them in predictable ways. Within internal memos, phrases like behavioral modification and special interrogation techniques appeared. To many inside the agency, this was defensive research. They believed they were protecting American personnel from similar treatment abroad. But the line between defense and application began to blur. As MKUltra expanded, it required cooperation beyond CIA headquarters. Universities were ideal partners. They offered laboratories, medical expertise, a steady flow of research subjects. Some researchers knew they were working with government funding, but did not understand the ultimate purpose. Others were fully aware. Grants were structured to conceal direct CIA involvement. Funds passed through intermediaries. Contracts used vague language. In this way, MKUltra embedded itself quietly into respected institutions. Psychiatric hospitals became another venue. Mental health facilities housed vulnerable populations, patients suffering from anxiety, depression, schizophrenia. Researchers argued that such environments allowed controlled study. In practice, oversight was limited. At the same time, the CIA considered using prisons. Incarcerated individuals could be offered reduced sentences or financial incentives in exchange for participation. The ethical boundaries were flexible. Sidney Gottlieb maintained a small circle of trusted colleagues who managed these subprojects. Compartmentalization ensured that no single researcher saw the entire picture. Even within the CIA, knowledge was restricted. The program operated under the Technical Services Division, and reports were tightly held. As the 1950s progressed, MKUltra took on a momentum of its own. Each experiment generated new questions. Each question led to another sub-project. Could drugs erase memory? Could personality be fractured and rebuilt? Could a person be induced to carry out actions against their will without later remembering? These ideas echoed the fears that had inspired the program. The so-called Manchurian Candidate, an unwitting operative programmed to act on command, became a topic of internal speculation. There is no conclusive evidence that MKUltra succeeded in creating such a figure, but the pursuit itself reveals how far the thinking had traveled. The Cold War mindset rewarded innovation, even when the innovation was unsettling. Secrecy became routine. Budgets were renewed annually. Justifications were written in measured tones. Meanwhile, outside the intelligence community, American life appeared ordinary. Suburbs expanded. Television sets flickered in living rooms. Families gathered for dinner. Few citizens had any awareness that within certain laboratories and clinics, experiments were underway, experiments exploring the fragility of perception itself. MKUltra was not a single dramatic event. It was an accumulation, a series of approvals, a web of subprojects, a gradual expansion from curiosity to commitment. And as it grew, so did its risks. Not all participants were volunteers in the true sense of the word. Not all understood what they were receiving, and not all would walk away unchanged. In the years ahead, some experiments would move beyond controlled settings, beyond willing subjects, beyond informed consent. But in 1953 and the years immediately following, MKUltra still wore the appearance of research, scientific, strategic, necessary. That was the justification. In a world defined by fear of hidden enemies, the mind itself had become both target and weapon. And under the guidance of Sidney Gottlieb, the CIA had committed to exploring that frontier, wherever it might lead. What began as an attempt to understand potential threats was quietly transforming into something more expansive. And soon the experiments would step out of the laboratory and into the lives of people who never agreed to participate at all. By the mid-1950s, MKUltra had moved beyond cautious laboratory inquiry. The early experiments inside CIA offices had produced mixed results. LSD was powerful, but unpredictable. Some subjects became euphoric. Others became frightened. A few experienced intense paranoia. Time seemed to stretch and fracture. Familiar rooms felt alien. For intelligence planners, unpredictability was both a problem and a temptation. If the effects could not be precisely controlled, perhaps they could still be exploited. And so the program entered a new phase, the use of unwitting subjects. Within the Central Intelligence Agency, certain officials began to argue that to truly understand how LSD might function in the field, it had to be tested under realistic conditions. That meant individuals who did not know they had been dosed. CIA operatives began slipping small amounts of LSD into drinks at dinner parties, in safe houses, even within government offices. Sometimes the targets were fellow agency employees. Sometimes they were military personnel. Occasionally they were civilians, The reasoning was clinical. A surprise dose, they believed, would reveal authentic reactions. There would be no preparation, no expectation, no placebo effect, but there was also risk. One of the earliest and most troubling episodes involved a man named Frank Olson. Olson was a respected Army scientist. He worked with the U.S. Army's biological warfare program at Fort Detrick in Maryland. In November 1953, he attended a retreat with CIA colleagues at a cabin in rural Maryland. During the gathering, LSD was quietly added to his drink without his knowledge. Within days, Olson appeared deeply disturbed. He seemed anxious, disoriented. According to colleagues, he began expressing doubts about his work and his future. 9 days later, Olson fell from the window of a New York City hotel room. He died on impact. At the time, his death was ruled a suicide. For decades, his family believed that explanation. But years later, as fragments of MKUltra surfaced, they learned that Olson had been secretly dosed with LSD. Shortly before his death. The revelation changed everything. Was his fall the result of psychological distress triggered by the drug? Or was there more to the story? Investigations would reopen the case. Questions would persist. The uncertainty would linger for generations. Frank Olson's death became one of the most haunting episodes associated with MKUltra, a reminder that experimentation in the shadows can have consequences that ripple outward. But the program did not stop. In fact, it expanded. One of the most unusual sub-projects carried the code name Operation Midnight Climax. In the late 1950s, the CIA established safe houses in San Francisco and later in New York. These apartments were rented under false identities and quietly outfitted for surveillance. Two-way mirrors were installed. Recording equipment was hidden. The settings were made to appear inviting, almost glamorous. The CIA hired sex workers to lure men into the apartments. Once inside, the men were offered drinks. Those drinks were sometimes laced with LSD. From behind the mirrors, CIA operatives observed the reactions. They took notes. They filmed encounters. They studied how the drug influenced behavior, especially in situations involving vulnerability and suggestion. The official justification was that such scenarios might resemble real-world espionage tactics. If a foreign agent attempted to compromise an American diplomat using drugs and seduction, the CIA wanted to understand the dynamics. But in practice, the men who entered those safe houses had no idea they were participating in an experiment. They were not informed. They did not consent. Some experienced confusion. Others panic. A few may never have fully understood what had happened to them. Operation Midnight Climax operated for years. It was secret even within the agency, and it was only one part of a broader pattern. Beyond safe houses, LSD was tested in prisons, in hospitals, in research clinics affiliated with universities. Volunteers were sometimes recruited with vague descriptions of medical research. Prisoners were occasionally offered incentives. The ethical standards varied widely. In some cases, participants signed consent forms, but those forms often did not explain the true sponsor of the research. In other cases, there was no consent at all. LSD was not the only substance explored. The CIA also studied barbiturates, amphetamines, and combinations of drugs designed to disorient or lower inhibitions. Researchers experimented with the idea of administering a depressant to weaken resistance, followed by a stimulant to encourage speech. They explored whether repeated dosing could fragment memory. Could a subject forget what they had revealed? Could amnesia be induced deliberately? Some of these experiments produced disturbing results. Subjects reported severe anxiety, hallucinations that felt indistinguishable from reality, lingering paranoia. For intelligence officials reviewing reports in Washington, these were data points, but for the individuals experiencing them, they were deeply personal disruptions. As the 1960s approached, LSD began spreading beyond laboratories. It entered academic circles, then countercultural communities. Ironically, the very drug the CIA had once hoped to weaponize became associated with anti-war protests and generational rebellion. Public awareness of LSD's effects grew. Inside the agency, enthusiasm began to wane. The unpredictability remained. There was no reliable way to command behavior with precision. The dream of creating a programmable agent proved elusive, yet the experiments continued in various forms. For some participants, the psychological impact was lasting. Memories blurred, trust eroded. In certain cases, individuals later claimed they had been altered in ways they could not fully explain. And still, most Americans had no idea. The safe houses were discreet. The grants were obscured. The memos were classified. To the public. The Cold War was visible in missile silos and televised speeches. What remained invisible were the quiet experiments that probed the boundaries of consciousness. By the late 1960s, as cultural upheaval swept the nation, internal questions began to surface within the CIA as well. Was MKUltra producing actionable results? Or had it drifted into territory that was ethically indefensible and strategically uncertain? The program's defenders argued that understanding extreme psychological states was essential to national security. Critics, though few and largely internal, worried about exposure. In 1973, as political scrutiny intensified in Washington during the Watergate era, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered many MKUltra files destroyed. Boxes of documents were shredded, paper trails vanished, but not all records disappeared. Years later, fragments would resurface. Surviving financial documents would reveal payments to universities and researchers. Testimony would bring hidden episodes to light. Among them, the story of Frank Olson. Among them, Operation Midnight Climax, and countless lesser-known individuals who had been dosed, studied, and then sent back into ordinary life, carrying experiences that could not fully explain. The early fear of communist brainwashing had led American intelligence down an unexpected path. In trying to defend the nation against a perceived threat, the CIA had experimented with the very boundaries of consent and control. The question that lingered was no longer whether mind control was possible. It was whether the pursuit of it had already crossed a line, and as the 1970s approached, that line would finally be brought into the light. By the late 1950s, MKUltra had spread far beyond CIA offices and safe houses. What began as chemical experimentation inside government facilities had expanded into universities, hospitals, and prisons. The program no longer depended solely on covert dosing at social gatherings. It now operated within respected institutions, places associated with healing, research, and rehabilitation. And for some of the people who entered those institutions seeking help, the consequences would last a lifetime. Among the most controversial figures connected to MKUltra was a psychiatrist named Donald Ewan Cameron. Cameron was not an obscure doctor working on the margins of medicine. He was internationally respected. Former president of both the American Psychiatric Association and the Canadian Psychiatric Association, a leading voice in his field. He worked at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, part of McGill University. Through CIA-funded channels, often disguised through front organizations, Cameron received money to conduct research into what he called psychic driving. The idea, in theory, was ambitious. Cameron believed that mental illness could be cured by breaking down a patient's existing personality patterns and rebuilding them from scratch. To do this, he used a combination of extreme methods. Massive electroconvulsive therapy, sometimes far beyond typical medical standards of the time. Drug-induced comas lasting days, sometimes weeks. Repeated audio messages played for hours through speakers or headphones, designed to implant new behavioral patterns. Patients were often given heavy doses of LSD and other psychoactive drugs. Some were placed in isolation. Many of these individuals had entered the institute for relatively common conditions: anxiety, postpartum depression, marital stress. They expected counseling, medication, rest. Instead, some underwent what Cameron described as depatterning, an attempt to erase existing thought structures. The goal was to reduce the patient to a childlike state, then rebuild the personality in a healthier form. In practice, the results were devastating. Former patients later described losing basic skills, memory gaps stretching across years, difficulty recognizing family members, inability to return to work. Some reported that childhood memories were wiped away. Others said they were left emotionally numb, struggling to form attachments. For them, treatment had not restored stability. It had fractured identity. At the time, oversight was limited. Cameron believed deeply in his methods, and the CIA, interested in any research that might illuminate how personalities could be broken down and reshaped, continued funding the work. It is important to note that not every psychiatrist in that era supported such extremes. Many were committed to patient welfare, but within the Cold War mindset, certain radical experiments found space to operate. The logic within intelligence circles was familiar. If an adversary was capable of psychological manipulation, understanding those techniques was essential. But the distinction between understanding and inflicting harm became blurred. Hospitals were not the only setting. Prisons also became testing grounds. Inmates were sometimes offered financial compensation or reduced sentences in exchange for participating in research studies. Some signed consent forms. Others may not have fully understood what they were agreeing to. LSD and other substances were administered in controlled environments. Researchers observed reactions, compliance, resistance, emotional breakdown, suggestibility. The incarcerated population provided a steady supply of subjects whose autonomy was already constrained. In the language of internal reports, these were volunteers. In reality, the power imbalance was significant. Could consent truly be voluntary when freedom was limited? These were questions rarely asked at the time, at least not loudly. The broader American public remained unaware. Hospitals and universities continued operating as respected pillars of society. Research grants flowed. Papers were published. But beneath some of that research lay hidden sponsorship. The CIA did not always inform institutional leadership of its involvement. Funds passed through intermediaries. The true purpose of certain studies was obscured. Compartmentalization protected the program. Even within the intelligence community, few saw the entire scope. Sidney Gottlieb oversaw the expanding web of subjects. Reports crossed his desk detailing experiments with sensory deprivation, placing subjects in environments devoid of light and sound to study psychological breakdown. Other projects examined sleep deprivation. How long could a person be kept awake before losing coherence? Before becoming more suggestible? The theory was that by destabilizing the mind, it might be possible to implant suggestions or extract information more easily. But repeated experimentation revealed something else. Extreme psychological stress often produced confusion, not compliance. Fragmentation, not control. Still, the experiments continued. By the early 1960s, MKUltra had been active for nearly a decade. Across North America, individuals who had entered clinics or prisons carried experiences they could not fully explain. Some remembered only flashes, bright lights, voices repeating phrases, long stretches of blankness. Others sensed that something in them had shifted permanently. Years later, when Senate hearings would expose fragments of MKUltra, some former patients would finally connect the dots. They had not simply been part of experimental psychiatry. They had been part of a classified intelligence program. For many, that realization compounded the trauma. Trust in medicine is built on transparency and care. Discovering that hidden funding had influenced treatment felt like betrayal. And yet, at the time these experiments were conducted, the prevailing narrative within intelligence circles framed them as necessary. The Cold War justified extraordinary measures. Officials believed they were engaged in a long, silent struggle against an adversary that did not respect conventional limits. In that context, ethical boundaries could seem negotiable. But human consequences are not theoretical. Families were affected, careers interrupted, mental health damaged. Some former subjects would later receive financial settlements after filing lawsuits. Others never learned they had been part of the program at all, because in 1973, as scrutiny intensified, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered many MKUltra files destroyed, shredded, eliminated. Without documentation, full accountability became difficult. Only fragments survived, financial records discovered in a warehouse years later. Enough to reveal the outlines of the program. Not enough to reconstruct every detail. The image that emerged was incomplete, but it was clear enough to raise profound questions. When fear drives innovation, how far is too far? When national security is invoked, who ensures that human dignity remains intact? The experiments conducted in hospitals and prisons were not isolated incidents. They were part of a larger pattern, a willingness to test the limits of psychological endurance in pursuit of strategic advantage. In the Cold War's shadow, the mind had become a frontier, but frontiers are rarely explored without cost. And for those who sought help within hospital walls or signed forms inside prison cells, the cost was deeply personal. As the 1960s gave way to political upheaval and rising public skepticism, the secrecy surrounding MKUltra would begin to erode. Investigative journalists would ask questions, Congress would demand answers, and a nation that had once feared foreign brainwashing would confront a different discomfort, the possibility that its own government had experimented on its citizens in the quiet name of protection. The reckoning was approaching, but for many victims the damage had already been done. By the early 1970s, the mood in America had changed. The Vietnam War had divided the country. Trust in government was eroding, and in 1974, the Watergate scandal forced a sitting president to resign. For the first time in decades, secrecy itself had become suspect. Investigative journalists began asking broader questions. If the White House could conceal illegal activity, what about intelligence agencies operating largely out of public view? In December 1974, a bombshell article appeared in the New York Times. Reporter Seymour Hersh revealed that the Central Intelligence Agency had conducted illegal surveillance on American citizens. The article did not focus on MKUltra specifically, but it opened a door. And once opened, it did not close. Public pressure mounted. Lawmakers demanded oversight. The Senate established a special investigative body with a long and formal name, the United States Senate Select Committee to Study Governmental Operations with respect to intelligence activities. Most Americans came to know it simply as the Church Committee. It was led by Senator Frank Church of Idaho, a thoughtful, deliberate man who believed that intelligence agencies were necessary, but not beyond accountability. The hearings began in 1975. For the first time, intelligence officials were called to testify under oath about covert operations, assassination plots, domestic surveillance. Secret programs that had operated for years without public knowledge. And then, slowly, references to behavioral experimentation began to surface. At first, details were fragmented. The CIA acknowledged that it had conducted research into drugs and interrogation techniques. Officials described the programs as limited, defensive, and discontinued, but the committee wanted documentation. That was when a crucial fact emerged. In 1973. As Watergate was unfolding and scrutiny of intelligence activities seemed likely, CIA Director Richard Helms had ordered the destruction of many MKUltra files. Boxes of documents were shredded. Records were burned. The official explanation was that the program had ended, and the materials were no longer needed. But the timing raised suspicions. What exactly had been destroyed, and why? Without complete records, the investigation faced a challenge. The committee could not reconstruct every experiment. It could not identify every subject. But not all evidence had disappeared. In 1977, during a separate Freedom of Information Act request, thousands of financial documents were discovered in a CIA records center. These files had survived because they had been stored separately from operational reports. The documents revealed payments to universities, research institutions, and individual scientists. They confirmed the existence of dozens of sub-projects, and they showed that MKUltra had been far more extensive than previously acknowledged. Public hearings followed. Former CIA officials testified that LSD had been tested, that some individuals had been dosed without their knowledge, that safe houses had been established for observation. The story of Frank Olson resurfaced. His family, who had long questioned the official explanation of his death, learned that he had been secretly given LSD days before falling from a hotel window in 1953. In 1975, President Gerald Ford met with the Olson family at the White House. He formally apologized on behalf of the government. The gesture was historic. It acknowledged that serious mistakes, had been made, but apologies could not restore lost years. As the hearings continued, a portrait emerged of an intelligence agency that had operated with minimal external oversight for decades. The Cold War, lawmakers concluded, had fostered an atmosphere in which secrecy became self-justifying. Senator Frank Church warned in his closing remarks that intelligence capabilities, if left unchecked, could threaten the very freedoms they were meant to protect. He spoke carefully, aware of the delicate balance the United States needed intelligence services, but it also needed boundaries. The exposure of MKUltra was not a single dramatic revelation. It unfolded gradually, testimony by testimony, document by document. Each disclosure prompted new questions. How many people had been affected? Were any experiments still ongoing? Had laws been broken? The answers were incomplete, because so many files had been destroyed. The full scope of MKUltra would likely never be known. Some critics argued that what had been revealed represented only a fraction of the truth. Others cautioned against speculation beyond documented evidence. The Church Committee faced a difficult task, distinguishing confirmed fact from rumor, acknowledging wrongdoing without inflaming public fear. In the end, the committee's work led to significant reforms. New oversight mechanisms were created. Permanent intelligence committees were established in both the House and the Senate to monitor CIA activities. Executive orders were issued prohibiting certain practices, including political assassinations. There was a recognition that intelligence work required secrecy, but secrecy could not mean immunity from accountability. For many Americans watching the hearings on television, the revelations were sobering. The idea that their own government had experimented with drugs on unwitting citizens challenged assumptions about trust. At the same time, the context of the Cold War still lingered. Some defended the CIA's actions as products of their time, shaped by fear of Soviet advances and nuclear confrontation. Others believed that ethical lines should never have been crossed. Regardless of circumstance, the debate was not simple. It rarely is when national security is involved. What was clear, however, was that MKUltra had not been a rumor. It had been real. Funded. Organized. Sustained for 2 decades. and only exposed because a broader crisis of confidence forced Congress to look more closely. As the hearings concluded, one truth remained unsettling. The destruction of records meant that certain names would never be known, certain stories would never be told, certain victims might never understand what had happened to them. History often depends on documents. When documents disappear, so too pieces of memory. The Church Committee brought light into a dark corner, but it could not illuminate everything, and that lingering uncertainty, what else might have been lost, what else might remain undiscovered, continues to shape how Americans view intelligence agencies today. In trying to protect the nation from external threats, the CIA had engaged in secret experiments that damaged trust at home. The exposure of MKUltra did not end debate. It began a debate about power. About fear, about the tension between security and liberty. And about how a democracy confronts the secrets kept in its name. When the hearings ended, the headlines faded, but the consequences did not. The exposure of MKUltra in the mid-1970s forced the United States into an uncomfortable period of reflection. The Cold War was still ongoing. The Soviet Union remained a nuclear adversary. Intelligence work was still considered essential, and yet something fundamental had shifted. For the first time, Americans had seen inside the machinery of secrecy. They had heard testimony about experiments conducted without consent. They had learned that records were destroyed. They had watched senators question intelligence officials in open session. The issue was no longer simply what had happened. It was what would happen next. In 1976 and 1977, additional hearings were held, prompted by the discovery of those surviving financial documents tied to MKUltra. These sessions dug deeper into the mechanics of the program, its funding, its sub-projects, its reliance on universities and hospitals. Former CIA officials acknowledged that LSD had been administered without the knowledge of some subjects. They described the program as misguided, poorly supervised, and ultimately ineffective. But explanation is not the same as accountability. One of the most visible moments of reckoning involved the family of Frank Olson. After learning that Olson had been secretly dosed with LSD in 1953, his family pressed for answers. The revelation reshaped their understanding of his death. In 1975, President Gerald Ford invited the Olson family to the White House. In a private meeting, he offered a formal apology on behalf of the United States government. He acknowledged that the CIA had acted improperly. He expressed regret for the suffering caused. The government later approved a financial settlement for the Olson family. It was a rare and symbolic moment, a sitting president apologizing for a covert intelligence operation. But apologies carry limits. For the Olson family, questions remained. Independent investigations would later revisit the circumstances of Frank Olson's fall from the hotel window. Some experts suggested the possibility of foul play. Others maintained that the evidence was inconclusive. The ambiguity endured. And the ambiguity reflected a broader truth about MKUltra. Because so many records were destroyed, certainty would remain elusive. Beyond the Olson case, other former subjects began coming forward. Patients who had undergone extreme psychiatric treatments under CIA-funded programs filed lawsuits. Some Canadian victims of Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron eventually received settlements from the Canadian government and, later, from the United States. These cases forced courts to confront complex questions. How do you prove harm when documentation is incomplete? How do you measure psychological injury that unfolded decades earlier? And how do you assign responsibility within a system built on compartmentalization? The legal battles were often slow and painful. Not every claimant succeeded. Not every case reached public attention, but collectively, they reinforced a growing awareness that intelligence work required clearer boundaries. In response to the Church Committee's findings, Congress moved to strengthen oversight. Permanent intelligence committees were established in both chambers. Their role was to review classified programs and ensure that covert operations complied with the law. Executive orders were issued to prohibit certain practices, including political assassinations and non-consensual human experimentation. The reforms did not dismantle the CIA. They were not intended to. Rather, they sought to create balance to ensure that secrecy did not eliminate accountability for intelligence professionals. This period was unsettling. Many believed their work had protected the nation during dangerous times. They worried that public exposure might weaken operational effectiveness. For civil libertarians, the reforms did not go far enough. They argued that MKUltra demonstrated how fear could erode ethical standards. Between those positions lay a difficult reality. The Cold War had encouraged extraordinary measures. Leaders feared that adversaries might develop weapons capable of manipulating thought. In that climate, experimentation seemed to some defensible, but hindsight offers clarity. The evidence suggests that MKUltra did not achieve reliable mind control. It did not produce programmable agents or flawless truth serums. What it produced instead were ethical dilemmas and damaged trust. As the 1980s approached, the immediate shock of the revelations began to fade from daily headlines. The intelligence community adapted to new oversight structures. Policies were formalized. Legal reviews became routine, yet MKUltra remained a reference point, a cautionary example of what can happen when secrecy expands unchecked. Within the CIA itself, there were internal reassessments. Training emphasized compliance with federal law and executive directives. Legal counsel gained greater influence in operational planning. The agency would continue to conduct covert activities, but the era of unmonitored behavioral experimentation had ended. At least officially. The deeper question lingered beneath the policy changes. How should a democracy confront its own missteps? Some nations bury uncomfortable chapters. Others confront them publicly. In the case of MKUltra, the United States did both. The Church Committee hearings aired disturbing facts. Presidential apologies acknowledged wrongdoing. Laws were revised. And yet, the destruction of records ensured that a portion of the story would remain incomplete. For the victims who came forward, recognition brought mixed emotions. There was validation, proof that their experiences were not imagined. But there was also frustration, because full transparency was impossible for many Americans. The revelations contributed to a broader skepticism that emerged in the 1970s. skepticism toward official narratives, toward claims of necessity, toward the phrase national security when used without explanation. Trust, once shaken, is slow to rebuild. The intelligence community understood this. In public statements, officials emphasized lessons learned. They stressed that human experimentation without informed consent was no longer permitted. They pointed to oversight committees as safeguards. Whether those safeguards are sufficient remains a matter of debate. But the exposure of MKUltra did alter the relationship between intelligence agencies and elected representatives. Secrecy would remain, yet it would no longer be entirely self-policed. The ethical reckoning of the 1970s did not erase the Cold War. It did not end covert operations. It did not remove the dilemmas inherent in intelligence work. What it did was establish a precedent that even in matters of national defense, actions taken in darkness may eventually come to light. And when they do, a nation must decide how to respond. With denial. With justification, or with acknowledgement. In the case of MKUltra, acknowledgement came, imperfect, incomplete, but real. An apology from a president, settlements in courtrooms. New laws on the books, and a lasting reminder that fear, when left unchecked, can push institutions beyond the boundaries they were created to defend. The reckoning was not dramatic. It unfolded in hearings, in legal briefs, in executive orders, but its implications were profound, because at its heart, MKUltra was not only about drugs or experiments. It was about power. Who holds it, how it is used. And what happens when oversight arrives years too late. The story was not over. The legacy of MKUltra would echo in culture, in conspiracy theories, in debates about government secrecy. But the era of unchecked experimentation had ended, and a democracy, confronted with its own shadow, had chosen, however imperfectly, to look at it. Even decades after the last experiments, MKUltra continues to capture the public imagination. Its legacy is complex, unsettling, and in many ways unfinished. The program officially ended in the early 1970s, yet the effects of its work continue to resonate in the lives of victims, in debates about government transparency, and in the broader cultural imagination for those who were unwitting subjects, the patients in hospitals, the prisoners, the individuals dosed with LSD without their knowledge. The consequences were personal and lasting. Memory loss, fractured identities, lingering anxiety, and a profound sense of betrayal marked their lives. Frank Olson's story, in particular, became emblematic of this human cost. A biochemist, a father, a citizen, he fell victim to secrecy and fear. His family spent decades seeking answers. His death, clouded by questions of ethics and accountability, reminds us that programs like MKUltra were never abstract. They were lived experiences, real and often tragic. Beyond individual lives, MKUltra shaped institutional practices. The CIA and other intelligence agencies were forced to confront the limits of secrecy and the necessity of oversight. The Church Committee's hearings in the 1970s exposed the danger of unchecked power. They revealed that secrecy, when combined with fear, can lead to extraordinary and often unethical experiments. From these revelations, The United States created new safeguards. Permanent intelligence oversight. Committees were established in Congress. Executive orders set boundaries for experimentation and intelligence work. Legal frameworks were strengthened to prevent similar abuses. Yet the program's influence also extended into popular culture. Books, films, and documentaries have explored MKUltra, often focusing on the mystery and fear of mind control. Stories of Manchurian candidates, secret experiments, and hallucinogenic drugs became part of the American psyche. MKUltra has become shorthand for the hidden, the manipulative, and the morally ambiguous. The program also prompted broader discussions about ethics in science and medicine. MKUltra revealed the dangers of experimentation without consent. It forced medical professionals, psychologists, and government officials to confront questions about autonomy, coercion, and moral responsibility. And even today, the questions linger. How far is too far in the name of national security? How do we balance the need to protect the public with respect for individual rights? And perhaps most importantly, how do we prevent history from repeating itself? For historians, ethicists, and citizens alike, MKUltra serves as a cautionary tale. It is a story about fear, the fear of enemies, the fear of vulnerability, the fear of what we cannot control. It is a story about power, the power of government, the power of science, and the power to manipulate human consciousness. And it is a story about responsibility. Because even in the shadow of existential threats, ethics cannot be optional. Decisions made in secrecy may appear necessary at the time, but history often judges them harshly. MKUltra also reminds us of the resilience of the human spirit. Survivors came forward, spoke out, sought justice, and demanded recognition. Families like the Olsons pursued truth, refusing to let silence or destruction of records erase their loved ones' stories. Their courage ensured that MKUltra could not remain entirely hidden. Finally, the program is a reflection of a particular era, the Cold War, with its anxieties, ambitions, and obsession with control. It reveals the extraordinary lengths a government might go to defend itself in an age defined by uncertainty. But it also warns that even the most justified fears can lead to actions that violate fundamental human rights. Today, MKUltra is both a historical record and a moral lesson. It is a reminder that vigilance is required, not only against external threats, but against the misuse of power at home. That democracy depends not only on the actions of its leaders, but also on the awareness and engagement of its citizens. As we reflect on MKUltra, we are left with a question that echoes decades later. What does it mean to protect a nation without violating the principles that define it? The answer is neither simple nor comforting, but it is essential, because the legacy of MKUltra is not only about the past, it is about how we as a society choose to navigate secrecy, science, and morality in the present and in the future. And somewhere in the quiet corners of history, we are reminded that power without accountability is dangerous. Knowledge without ethics is perilous, and curiosity, when untethered from conscience, can leave lasting scars. MKUltra remains a shadow, a caution, and a lesson, a story of science, fear, and human consequence. And as long as those lessons are remembered, the program's secrets continue to speak quietly but insistently. to each generation that seeks to understand them. It is a story that began in secrecy, reached into the minds of ordinary people, and ultimately returned to the public eye, reminding us in subtle but undeniable ways that the pursuit of control over others comes at a cost that cannot be erased. The questions it raises remain with us today, lingering in the spaces between knowledge and morality, secrecy and transparency, fear and responsibility, because MKUltra is more than history. It is a mirror showing what happens when curiosity, power, and fear collide in the shadows.